these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks, to the greatest policy podcast in America. We have had some... Don't laugh. All right. One of my favorite doctors in America is with me, Dr. Reynolds Delgado. He's been on the show before. Doctor, thank you so much for being back on. Local Houston hero. Look, saving patients every day, not just COVID patients, but all kinds of patients. We'll get into some really interesting things you've done on lung transplants with fatal COVID patients and saved all 6, you said? That's
Correct.
Amazing. So
Correct.
we'll talk about that. I want to give everybody a quick overview of what we're dealing with on COVID. Reason we're doing this podcast, a big announcement from the CDC last week, basically telling us what every common sense person knew already. If you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask around others. We'll get into that and the politics surrounding it. I want to give everybody a quick update on what's going on in Texas. Governor Abbott announced 0 COVID-related deaths reported yesterday. That's pretty great. Fewest COVID cases in over 13 months. Lowest 7-day COVID positivity rate ever. Lowest COVID hospitalizations in 11 months. The downtrend continues. Hospital capacity is getting better and better. We only have just under 12% of ICU beds filled with COVID patients. Under 4% of the general beds are filled with COVID patients. New cases under 300 a day. And what else should we say here? Yeah, just generally decreasing. And yet what's interesting in Harris County, we continue to be in a designated stay home, work safe designation, which is the highest threat level. Our esteemed county judge, Lena Hidalgo, has kept the county on this level for the last year, 12 months, despite similar counties in Texas changing their threat levels. By the way, this means, by definition, according to her own designation, that outbreaks are present and worsening. Of course, this isn't true according to the metrics. What's interesting about this downtrend in Texas is, Abbott made a big announcement. What date was that? I mean, it wasn't long ago that Texas was fully open. But those of us who've been living in Texas for the last 6 months know that it was pretty open. So it's I don't think a lot changed, to be honest, with the mask mandates. Look, a lot of businesses still require masks. I don't think there was a big change there. That is changing now, only in the last week, really. But and as people get vaccinated more. But that downtrend was happening with or without the vaccine, and I do want to kind of hit on that, just theorize as to why that might be.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me again, Dan, and we're all really gratified and happy that you're back in the saddle now and recovered from your recent issues. And
yeah.
and so I just wanted to mention that. But thanks again.
It.
So yes, so the curves in the hospital are flattening out, and they're way down. So there was a spike, and then a second spike, and then a third spike, and now we're way on a downslope here. And so the ICUs are not filled with COVID patients, and things are. So this is the natural history of how viral flare-ups and burnouts occur. Mm-hmm. This is just naturally how it occurs. And so this is fully expected, and our ability to become normal is imminent, I think, and already it has been in Texas for a while, as you say. So the vaccines, so around a third of the U.S. population is vaccinated, 41% here in Houston. There's another third or so of the population that has immunity by whatever means they were in contact, and so there's a growing smaller percentage of people that have no immunity and are just now, our general averseness to being all together in big crowds. Put all that together, and basically, this is a problem that's going away.
Yeah, I mean, just mathematically speaking, and it has to go away at a certain point, just by the science and the math. there's clearly those in the political arena and certainly in the media that never want it to go away. And that's what's been so mind-blowing to me, just about the reaction to the CDC director's announcement. She was like, so I was on Meet the Press this weekend, and always a combative show, especially for Republicans. But I was on and I listened to the entire interview between Chuck Todd and Dr. Walensky, the head of the CDC, and it was extremely combative. Right. And they're on the same team in theory. And what struck me as odd about that interview was, look, when the CDC director says, "Hey guys, guess what? You don't have to wear a mask anymore if you're vaccinated." A lot of us with common sense were looking at her like, "Wait, you were wearing a mask after you got vaccinated?" like what? Because I remember when the guidance was, look, wear a mask if you can't socially distance. You're like, all right, that makes sense. If you're going to be close talking somebody, and you don't know if you're virulent or not, then maybe wear a mask, right? That makes sense. 3 to 6 feet was this. That's what the science said. If we're quote unquote listening to the science, 3 to 6 feet, and then that quickly became wear a mask if you're living in civilization at all times. If you're alone walking your dog in the park, you better wear that mask. Look, I don't think Houstonians ever agreed to that nonsense. Mm-hmm. I rarely ever saw that. But I also travel between here and D.C. all the time. And I'll tell you what, in D.C., right at this moment, there are people alone in a park wearing a mask.
Right.
100%. So, and they're listening to the science. At least they believe they are. So it's very odd. Anyway, that was my reaction to the CDC director. But Chuck Todd had a totally different reaction. His reaction was, wait a second, you said don't do this 3 days ago. How do you know people are vaccinated? What are we going to do? I mean, they took the opposite approach. Mm-hmm. They think the CDC is being extreme. And there's so many statements like this from the press. Look at Leanna Wen, CNN contributor, former head of Planned Parenthood. She says the CDC's new guidance has devolved into a giant mess. It was a major blunder to cede responsibility, effectively ending mask mandates. It's not just about science. It's a major policy decision that the president himself should have made. We love that statement because it's like, wait a second, I thought you were supposed to listen to the science, mm-hmm. not politicians. Because under Trump, you weren't allowed to listen to Trump. You had to listen to the science. The press kept asking Rochelle Walensky, the head of the CDC, who's supposed to be the vaccination police? How do you know? And the CDC director said, rightfully, we're asking people to take their health into their own hands, get vaccinated. If they don't, they'll continue to be at risk. I've been saying that for over a year. I think that's absolutely right. I'm not sure where this finally came from. The other one I want to point out, this one's really infuriating. It's one of the reasons we've lost trust in Dr. Fauci. He came out with Dr. Walensky and said, yes, you don't have to wear masks if you've been vaccinated. And then a day later, he says, quote, he, referring to Senator Rand Paul, because those two, man, that's like America's greatest couple right now. Senator Rand Paul was saying, if you've been infected or you've been vaccinated, don't wear a mask, which is completely against all public health tenets, Fauci continued. So he's dead wrong. I mean, I don't have anything personally against him. Yeah, you do. But he's just quite frankly incorrect. Okay, so Dr. Fauci, you've contradicted yourself yet again, over and over. I mean, where does this come from?
Well, it's all about social engineering. And whether or not the government and elected officials and then government officials really should be in the business of trying to socially engineer or fool people into doing things.
Yeah.
And I know where you stand on this, and I stand in the same way. I mean, as soon as you start down that road, you're on a slippery slope towards losing all kinds of civil liberties. Yeah. So it's so important not to, for the government and people like Fauci, who is a government official, to not try to fool people, but rather educate people.
Mm-hmm. Give us all the facts. This is why I lost trust with Fauci over time. He definitely tried to manipulate people, and he admitted it later. Telling people not to get masks at first, having people like me repeat that. And then I get yelled at later, right? I'm like, look, I was just saying what Dr. Fauci said. Then it turns out later he's like, well, I just didn't want you guys to go buy them because I wanted to save them for healthcare professionals. Just tell us that. Right. We're adults. Because that's a very reasonable thing to say. Mm-hmm. Hey, we're not even, because look, the science back then said, and maybe it still does, we're not even sure if these work. We think they might within 3 to 6 feet. It's a good precaution, but honestly, healthcare professionals need them more. So save them for them. That's a very honest thing to say and perfectly reasonable thing to say. Just say it. The other thing, he lost my trust when he refused to contextualize any of his comments. When he would come out and say, look, if you're 15, you could die. Well, that's true. But the probability of dying is less than if you get the flu.
Right.
If you're under 20 years old. So, contextualize it. Be a good scientist instead of a propagandist.
Well, and a doctor. I mean, he is a physician, and as physicians, that's one thing we do is we don't do what's called paternalism, basically, where we're trying to fool and take care of our patients as if they were children. We give them the facts and let them make informed decisions, and that's how a doctor, and I think that's how someone in Fauci's position should do it.
Yeah, and that makes a lot more sense. Can we theorize a little bit? What's your take on? We touched on it a little bit, but just the natural progression of a wave, of a trend, and in Texas in particular. Look, I mean, my layman's theory on this is that we'd reached a point of infection rate and therefore immunity in the population where just mathematically speaking, it would be very hard to increase cases.
Right.
It's not quite herd immunity. I don't think that's the right term for it, but it's a burnout, if you will.
I think that's a better way to think of it, as a burnout and the flattening of the curve that really is going to be a terminal flattening. In other words, it's going to continue to flatten until something new happens. Now, what is that new? Well, maybe a variant, but I don't see another spike.
Yeah,
that way.
And talk to us about the nature of viruses a little bit. We've talked about this in the past, but I want you to repeat it. How they evolve, why the death rates might have been more severe at first, and how later strains change.
Yeah, this is really interesting because viruses follow the principles of natural selection. Okay, so there's this really great old Einstein quote. It's God is subtle but not capricious. And the relevance is that these viruses aren't trying to fool us. Mm-hmm. It's not trying to trick us. It doesn't have some mind of its own. It's just trying to survive.
Yeah.
Right? So the virus is just trying to survive, right? And so the survival of the fittest. So the fittest viruses will continue to go on and infect people and go throughout the population, and the less fit ones will not. And so it evolves very frequently. In fact, it evolves from city to city. You can actually tell by doing gene sequencing on the viruses and people in one city and another city and tell which city infected what city. So it evolves a lot, frequently. And during this evolution, the spike protein, which is the protein that our immune system reacts against, changes subtly. And as those changes occur, your immunity that you had in the past becomes a little less effective. Now, if you still have immunity from the past, then it's somewhat effective, so it's less chance you're going to get really sick if you get this new variant. But that's how it works, and that's how the variants work, and that's why we need to not get crazy, out of control, afraid of these variants. The variants, that's a natural phenomenon. It's supposed to happen. It's going to evolve towards being more communicable, yes, but less virulent.
And it gets to this example in Singapore. They're on lockdown again. I mean, indoor dining suspended immediately, travel bubbles, whatever. All these things, even though they have a 22% fully vaccinated, you've got certain fear porn epidemiologists claiming there's a surge. They were fact-checked by Nate Silver on Twitter as he shows an actual graph of new cases. There's no surge, and they're freaking out because of this variant. Mm-hmm. But as you say, there's just no indication that these variants are as dangerous as these. Again, let's call them fear porn doctors or fear porn health officials would like us to believe. And we need to get to a point where we start looking at this disease a little bit more rationally.
Right. And the way I like to think of it is looking at it more like the flu.
Yeah.
And so the principles by which it evolves are similar to the principles by which the flu has evolved over time. And we need to look at it more like the flu and get to where we are societally dealing with it like we deal with the flu. So ultimately, I'd like to see very soon, hopefully, where it's just a once-a-year booster for those at risk, just like we do for the flu. And that booster is taken from very heavily populated areas of the world, usually the Asia-Pacific area. You take the strains there, you make your vaccine out of them, you get people vaccinated in the fall, and then you go about your life. And you vaccinate those that need it, of course, healthcare workers and elderly, et cetera. And so I think that's where we're going to be going with this. And history is on my side in that thought, and natural selection and science of how the flu and other viral infections have gone, it makes this the most likely scenario for the future. Now, is it possible that one of these variants will flare up and become super virulent? It is possible, yes, but it is very unlikely.
Yeah. Tell us about, in these worst cases where you actually did a lung transplant. Is that unique to Houston or in your practice? How many have you done across the country?
Right, yeah. So there's been very few. Well, so, we're blessed in this city in Houston to have the world's greatest medical center. And of course, I biasly believe that I work at the world's greatest cardiovascular hospital, the Baylor St. Texas Heart Institute. And so we did 6 successful lung transplants for patients for COVID. So these are COVID patients on ECMO, which means the full support, full, definitely dead unless we do something dramatic. And so we pulled off 6 successful lung transplants for that. And I want to put my hats out to Dr. Gabriel Luer, one of my colleagues, who's the lung transplant surgeon, a very talented young surgeon who pulled this off, and the rest of our team at Baylor St. Luke's for that. And it just goes to show you that, we have the capability to beat this on many fronts. And then later we can talk about some new meds coming online and things like that. And again, the evolution of the vaccine. The vaccine will be evolving to take into account the variables over time, just like the flu vaccine does.
Well, that's important to note about new meds and all that is our ability to treat this it's like we're in a totally different universe than a year ago.
Right. Yeah. Just dexamethasone alone made a huge difference.
Yeah.
Just that alone. So yeah, we're far better now.
Is there anything you take issue with in the CDC guidance? I mean, you've got it in front of you here. Were you just as surprised as I was that it took this long to come out with this?
Yes.
And just the comments made prior.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if they weren't getting some kind of heat to come out of this before summer vacation.
Yeah, like from people like me, because we're just like, what the hell are you guys talking about? I mean, and I think that's why it reeks of political decision to me.
Well, yeah. The other part of that is the vaccine versus non-vaccine. So that completely polarizes people. So if you're vaccine, you get all the green smiley faces. If you're not vaccinated, you get all the red and yellow frowny faces with masks on. Yeah. And they're nice diagrams.
Can't do anything.
Yeah. And so it's really creating a polarization and so one step away from people having to wear some kind of armband that says
they keep pushing for that, and like I get asked about it a lot from constituents, and I'm like, don't worry. And I do mean that. I know they talk about it a lot. I don't see how that would ever happen.
Right.
I mean, constitutionally, practically, I honestly don't see it, and I encourage people not to freak out too much about it. But it doesn't mean that the left doesn't want it. All right. You got Rachel Maddow who's quoted saying something like, "I have to train myself not to see unmasked people as some kind of enemy or danger."
Right.
And I'm like, you are a pathological thinker. If that's how you've been this entire time, there's something wrong with you. Rachel.
Right.
Like something deeply, deeply wrong with you. And this is, and again, like just in DC, I'm telling you, people look at you like you're a bad, bad person if you're walking alone on the sidewalk with no mask. Now, what's interesting about a place like Washington, D.C. is this is a highly educated, a lot of people have a lot of master's degrees. So they're supposed to be the smart ones who understand how to interpret data and science. And it's completely the opposite because the science does not say that there's any transmission outside unless you're like breathing into somebody's face. I mean, it's like less than 1%. So the misinformation campaigns run by the media are so absurd. They got a Joe Scarborough, Mika Brzezinski on Morning Joe saying they'll keep wearing masks on airplanes despite being vaccinated. Just makes good common sense. It doesn't make good common sense. Say because you're scared. I mean, give us a different explanation besides it's common sense because it's the opposite of common sense. This isn't true. And if it's just based on infection rates, based on case levels, based on the fact that an airplane has turned out to be one of the safest places to be, just because of how often the air recirculates. So I'm so sick of the misinformation, and they're just never called out on it.
Well, I'm not going to try to apply logic to those that would do that would create non-mask shaming now. The great Shakespeare quote, "Seek not logic where none dwells." But, the fact is that we cannot go down that road where people are having to wear a scarlet letter, whether or not they've been vaccinated or not. That's simply just too far to go as far as limitations, civil liberties, and the slippery slope there. And we just can't do that. So somehow we got to get out of that mindset. And the only way to do that is going to be from the leadership, from on high. It's got to come from the administration, from our elected leaders, and they need to get us out of this kind of discriminatory thinking. Otherwise, think about this. I mean, it's all these private restaurants. In 2 weeks, I'm going to the Indy 500. I was invited to go to the Indy 500 and sit in these wonderful box seats, and so they send me an email telling me your tickets are on the way. Oh, by the way, will you please send me a picture of your vaccine card before we send your tickets? So it's starting. I mean, it's vaccine discrimination, we call it.
It is, and it's what blows my mind about it is like if you're not vaccinated, it's your risk, which has always been my opinion on the virus the entire time. I understand that there's, at the broader level, there is a concern about hospitals being overrun, but in the grand scheme of things, and the data shows this, and very clearly over the past year, the virus runs its course basically no matter what you do. Study after study after study has shown that lockdowns do not have a correlation with or any effect on the trends of the virus. The area under the curve is always the same. Again, I do understand that you have to apply that to your hospital capacity, but it seems very, very obvious to me that if we were to learn any lessons from this, and unfortunately there's an entire side of the country that doesn't want to learn lessons from this, but if we were to objectively learn lessons from this, it seems to me that the best application of our resources and our efforts in a future pandemic would be increasing capacity at the healthcare level, as opposed to trying to control a natural spread of a virus. We have proven completely ineffective in controlling it around the world. We've proven completely ineffective. And never before in human history have we even tried because we know it's stupid.
Right.
But for some reason in the year 2020, at the pinnacle of modern civilization, we thought we could, and we failed. And we need to acknowledge that failure and acknowledge that it's impossible, and that a better use of our resources would be to continue to create and generate wealth by not destroying our businesses and our economy, and then use that wealth to, look, we did some things right, like Operation Warp Speed, increase hospital capacity. Here in Houston, we were a little freaked out. We opened up an entire stadium for hospital capacity. We never used it, never needed it. But that was the right move. That's a good investment of money, in my opinion, in the face of a pandemic. We sent hospital ships to New York, never needed them.
Right.
But that's the right kind of thinking.
Yeah. I think two things I would say. One is we need to be prepared for the next go-round when and if something like this happens in the future, and have the ability to ramp up capabilities to take care of it. but number one and most important is we got to get back to normal. Getting back to normal means treating this like we treat the flu. Mm-hmm. Within a year, I'd like to see that happening. That's number one, because if not, the damage to society is serious and deep. And number two, be prepared for the next go-round if it occurs. Unlikely to occur, again, as natural selection tells us. It's gonna be more prevalent but less virulent. So unlikely, but be prepared. But number three, I think there's a third important one, and it is learn some lessons. Learn some lessons. And so what is the lesson that we have learned from this? Well, besides not eating bats, perhaps we need to look into this whole issue of viral containment and how we study viruses.
Yeah, and this came up in our favorite couple dispute between Dr. Fauci and Rand Paul.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So just basically to say how this works is there's these labs known as BSL-4 labs, so biosafety level 4 labs, and they're all over the world. There's 9 in the United States. There's 30-ish of them in the world. And these labs study viruses of all types. And there's this particular research going on within these labs, including in Wuhan, called gain-of-function research. So basically, they manipulate the virus so that it is more powerful, therefore using that more powerful version to study in animals and cell cultures and study drugs and whatnot. And so, this is, we don't know for sure that this pandemic arose from such research. We don't. But we do now know that it's possible. Mm-hmm. And given that possibility, should we really be doing this type of research?
Yeah.
And I think my answer to that is, well, let's really rethink this. Maybe this is a lesson learned from all this. And maybe the way to rethink it is this, the overall societal benefit of doing this gain-of-function research and keeping all these horrible pathogens in these labs worth the potential risk of it getting out? And I think that argument was maybe reasonably possible to defend years and years ago. I don't think so now. Why? Much of this research can now be done using computer modeling. It's called in vitro versus in silico. So in vitro is doing in a lab with actual virus. In silico means doing computer modeling in computers that can take a DNA sequence and model what the protein will look like and what the antigens and the antibody interactions will look like. And so much of this research can now be done with computer modeling. Second, there are actual viruses in containment labs in parts of the world that have not infected a human being for decades. Mm-hmm. Smallpox is a great example. And yet they still are in existence. And I think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
It's a mistake because obviously it's possible that it could get out. And you think COVID's bad, boy, smallpox is horrible.
Devastating.
It's horrible. And so smallpox exists in labs in the United States and in Russia. And I think that's a mistake. And, the scientists would say, well, what if we need to study it at some future point? Well, we now have the technology to gene sequence anything we want. Mm-hmm. If there is some random reason in the future why we somehow need to study smallpox, we can make it from scratch now. So there is no need or reason to keep it in storage.
So Dr. Fauci was wrong on that, and Senator Rand Paul was right. Senator Rand Paul, I think, took your
The gain-of-function research, I think, is a really serious issue. That is a lesson that we need to learn from this whole thing. That going forward will help us prevent future pandemics.
Fundamentally, what you're talking about is it's a cost-benefit analysis. And I think what we need to, if I were to broaden what we need to learn, it's the ability to analyze policy and situations with a cost-benefit analysis. That's the learning lesson. So whether there's too much risk in keeping diseases in labs, perhaps there is, and what's the benefit of that? And if the benefit doesn't outweigh the risk or the cost, then don't do it. cost-benefit analysis on lockdowns. I already went over that. I've gone over that a million times on this podcast. But that's how you make policy decisions. And there was this belief amongst the left, and it was just, for some reason, it became partisan. It was exclusively amongst the left, that the only goal in policy was to reduce cases. And that's not the only goal in policy. There's balance. There's a lot of factors. There's costs. There's benefits. If the only goal was to reduce COVID cases, then by all means, lock everybody in a room, right? Like, I mean, you deal with all sorts of issues, heart disease being still the number one killer of Americans. What would you tell Americans if you didn't want there to be any more heart attacks? I mean, you would force us to eat and exercise a certain way. You would force us, right? But what are the costs of that? And what's the practicality of it? I'm so blown away by the lack of critical thinking that occurred over the last year. It blows me away, and it makes me very sad.
Well, the damage to society of how we dealt with this pandemic has not fully been appreciated yet.
No.
There is deep-seated damage to our economy, to our society. There's loss of entire industries. There's everything that goes along with that in the psyche of society, with depression and homelessness and people destitute and such. And it's just, that has not been appreciated. It hasn't fully played out yet either.
No.
I still think, we're probably heading for some sort of recession or something. And so that's something that was totally lost in the fervor of trying to stop all the cases. Mm-hmm. And you and I talked about this last summer when we did this podcast. That very thing, we predicted that even then.
Yep.
And
the one thing I couldn't predict was that this would continue after the election. I mean, a large part of me, like, I've analyzed the psychology of why people believe what they believe about COVID, and a part of me did believe that it would at least change after the election, because a large part of it was politically driven. But I guess the thing is once you've attached yourself to an ideology, you can't let go. And there's a lot of people that love the idea of collectivism. They love the idea of everybody doing what they're told to do in it together. It makes them feel like a tribe. Mm-hmm. It's a very human thing to want. It's, as a conservative, it's very anti-conservative. We're much more individualistic. And the more you try to tell us what to do, the more it pisses us off. No. If you had just asked everybody to wear masks, I don't think the mask controversy would be a thing. Everybody would be like, it's not really a big deal. Wear the stupid mask. But you try to mandate it, and it really irks people. You try to mandate vaccines, it makes them think that you're hiding something. And
well, the whole collectivism versus individualism thing, you cannot force that on people. You just can't. I mean, it will backfire. And history has taught us that so many times.
Over and over again. It's amazing we still have these discussions, frankly. And it's like, look, utopia is not possible. It's a Greek word for no place. Right. that's literally what it means. But there's a lot of people who still believe in it. You wanted to talk about vaccines, actually.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You're pro-vaccine. You don't think they should be mandated, but
well, no. It's not that I'm necessarily pro-vaccine. I just think they're safe. Yeah. And just a quick explanation of that. So this is one area where we made a lot of predictions last summer when we did this podcast, and most of them were right, including the variants coming around the new year and all that stuff. But one thing I was wrong about is how the efficacy of the vaccines. I predicted around 50%. In fact, they're very, very good. 90+% for. And
that's unusual for vaccines, you're saying.
And yeah, it's very unusual. So most vaccines, like the flu vaccines of the past, were around 50%.
Huh.
And so why is that? So the reason is because of new tech. Basically, the Pfizer, Moderna are new tech, brand new technology. Excuse me. So old technology was you take the virus, you chop it up, you distill it, take the proteins out that you want, and hope that a lot of other junk doesn't get in there with it. And then you inject that in people and they make antibodies. The new tech is very cool, actually. You take a bit of the DNA from the virus, just a bit, just the part that makes the spike protein. And then you create RNA from that. So RNA is just basically a photo negative of it. Mm-hmm. You take the RNA from that, and you give that RNA to the person, and then that RNA gets into their cells, and your own cells then take up that RNA and then create the protein from scratch. So it's very pure. So really, it's far purer than the old tech, and it just gives you that spike protein, and so you produce it yourself. So reactions are less, like serum sickness reactions we call it, or your immune system going overboard because there's a lot of impurities in it. Mm-hmm. This is very pure. And so it is safer from that perspective. Now, some will say, oh, can it give you you're injecting this RNA, and could it mess with your DNA? And can it give you some kind of weird cancer, some crazy thing in the future, and we don't know years from now? So what I would say to that is this new tech, though it's new for viruses, it has been used for other treatments of other diseases. So for cancer chemotherapy, immunotherapy, and cancer, it's been used for many, many years. So there is some experience with the messenger RNA technology going back for other disease states. So it's not entirely new. So that, hopefully. But second is you're giving RNA, not DNA. So DNA theoretically could, mess with your DNA, but RNA can't. RNA is the effect, not the is the product, not the source of the product. So it's not going to mess with your DNA. So basically, don't fear the vaccines. Our biotech companies have done a great job here, honestly.
That's maybe another. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is the kind of old type of technology, right?
Yeah, it's oldish, so it's kind of in the middle.
Okay.
Yeah.
One thing, I don't have my facts completely straight on this, but I thought I read an article about Canada having a lot of trouble getting people vaccinated. Have you heard anything about along those lines?
Yeah, a lot of countries are having a lot of trouble. So people, not only Canada, but a lot of third world countries.
Well, definitely the third world countries, that's for sure. But
we should pay some attention to that because why? Because where the variants are going to come is from highly populated areas with little immunity. So in other words, the virus is circulating a lot. That's where the new variants are going to come. And so this newest variant is coming from India.
Yeah.
Now, like I said, the variants, just another word. The variants, our current vaccines do work on the variants. Mm-hmm. They do. So the current studies show, for Pfizer, for example, that it's 94% of old COVID and 74% for new COVID, for new variants. Mm-hmm. So it still works.
Pretty good.
So, but even if you aren't still in that 26% that get it, a variant, having had the Pfizer, you're not going to get as sick.
Yeah.
So that's an important point.
That's really important to note. What's your theory? Why did India have such a late spike?
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It's so crowded there. Like, why wouldn't they gotten it earlier?
Right.
It's not like they have a really well-organized society that just dealt with it perfectly.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. I thought about that myself. It is a little weird that they didn't flare when everywhere else flared, but now they're flaring. So
African countries too. I've never heard of major outbreaks in African countries. Mm-hmm. I could just be wrong about that. It's just not reported. Yeah. But I believe that's somewhat correct.
Yeah.
We just don't know why.
But it's going to percolate through all the world.
It just will eventually.
Yeah, the whole world.
There's just less travel maybe through Africa, and
perhaps.
These things are kind of interesting.
Or a vagary of the variant.
Yeah.
The variants are doing their own thing, and just like the flu.
The place I was going with the thinking about Canada and other Western developed countries with their access to the vaccine is talking about our biotechnology. A lot of discussion right now in Congress about price controls on drugs. Drugs are too expensive in the U.S. This frustrates us. Frustrates a lot of Americans. at the same time, the only way you get to argue about the price of a drug is if the drug exists. Okay. And it turns out that we were the country that made it. It turns out that well over 300 vaccines and treatments are being worked on for COVID in the United States. The next country that even comes close is China with like 30. We have all the innovation here. I mean, Houston's a great place for it. And the way that generally works is small biotech firms, they do the investor rounds. They take that risk. It's a few people. It's a startup. And they're hoping to get bought out by big pharma.
Right.
Evil big pharma. But this is how it works. And it's reason that we have access to far more drugs than other countries do.
Right.
Just that is a fact, especially when it comes to the really serious stuff, the really cutting edge stuff, especially cancer treatments, things like that. Am I on the right track so far?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, people need to understand that these big companies, big pharma companies, J&J, Pfizer, all these companies are not our enemy. And, they have issues, of course, but they are the hero here. They are a hero. There are many heroes. They are a hero here. And the insurmountable importance of innovation. I mean, basically, major serious threats, this country has the ability to innovate its way out of. And that is because this country creates the ecosystem that allows for innovation.
Yeah.
It's very important. And without that ecosystem, without the fertile ground to allow for innovation, then we're stuck in the mud and things like this come around, and then we're really at risk.
Yeah.
We won't be able to innovate treatments, innovate vaccines
and that
quickly, and that ecosystem is driven by need for protection of IP, intellectual property rights. So I know there's been some discussion about loosening intellectual property. I'm very much against that.
Yeah.
Intellectual property is critical for innovation.
You basically ensure that they'll never take that risk again.
Right.
And by ecosystem, you also mean profit, right? Protection of patents and profit. There has to be profit. I hear so many doctors, who lean to the left, go on and say the biggest problem with our healthcare system is that it's profit driven, right? And people hear that. And it's a very populist argument.
All they need to do is go and try to get healthcare in one of the EU countries.
I also say to those doctors, fine, then let's cut your salary in half. Because that's what you're saying.
Yeah. And that it's just lack of understanding of the alternative.
Right.
And the alternative, in Britain is a great example because Britain's a very civilized country. Mm-hmm. But their healthcare system is 20 years behind ours. And it is rationed. So you cannot get a heart transplant after age 65 or a kidney transplant after age 65 in England.
And the thing about healthcare, I was posed this question, and it haunted me after. It was when I was on Joe Rogan's podcast like a year ago. And he poses this question to me. He's like, why can't we just treat healthcare like we treat firefighters? And I tried to give him some kind of complex economic theory argument. And in hindsight, that was just the wrong argument. Mm-hmm. The right argument is, look, if we had all the treatments, all the cures, and all the basic equipment we ever needed for any kind of health issue, and we could plan exactly what it would be, then you could maybe make an argument that it could be sort of confiscated by government and distributed in a very equal way, the way firefighting is. But the problem here is that you're just comparing apples to oranges in an extreme sense.
Yes.
Firefighting, you literally do one job. You put out a fire. You do it occasionally, and you have no real need to innovate the way that you firefight. You just pour water on a fire. Mm-hmm. Okay. Healthcare is so different. Also, you do it once at a time. There's not like ongoing care for a fire.
Sure.
Healthcare is the opposite of that in every single way. And I don't think people get that because often, look, he was just asking a question that people ask all the time,
right?
Which is, I don't get why it's different.
Yeah. Well, for someone who is an insider. I know because I've been to all the EU countries. I've worked in hospitals. I've seen patients in hospitals in EU countries and Britain and third world countries. And I've been all around and seen all this. As an insider, I'll tell you unequivocally, clearly, there is no question that the healthcare system in this country is the best in the world. Just, and by far, by a large margin. Now, is it too expensive? Yes, it's expensive. Yes. Is it all run by all these big insurance companies? Yeah, it's all run by these big insurance companies.
Yeah, there's problems.
But that's the lesser of evils.
Yeah. Like we don't deny there's problems, and look, I mean, there's bipartisan legislation to fix some of the loopholes that drug companies do engage in. To kind of screw with the patent system a little bit. Like they're not perfect actors, and I don't want to give the audience the impression that I would propose that. They're definitely not. There's things we can improve upon, but policy is about trade-offs. And what the Democrats want to do with what's called H.R. 3, which is basically it is effectively a price control. They call it a negotiation, but that has been long debunked. It is not a negotiation at all. It is price controls, and you will destroy future innovation. Right? You can get away with it once. You can confiscate all existing drugs right now. And you can get away with that once, and you can make them produce them, and you can set your price, and you can distribute them. But you'll never get another drug again. Mm-hmm. That's the thing, and that's the trade-off that they don't talk about.
Right. Yeah, it's so hard to innovate in other countries, even EU countries, and it's just so hard.
Yeah. Well, glad we settled that. What else do you want to add to the discussion?
Oh, just a quick talk about drugs coming up. So. What we really need is a drug you can take like we take Tamiflu for a flu, and that's coming. There are a couple of drugs that are looking very favorable there. One called favipiravir.
Okay, we're going to need to rename that one.
Yeah. And molnupiravir. So, oral drugs that'll be an equivalent of like Tamiflu for this. So that's great. Dexamethasone is so great. It's done such great things. We talked about our 6 successful lung transplants in the extreme cases. So we're on it. We're on it. And the vaccines are great, and they're going to, the boosters coming up sometime within the next year are going to incorporate all these variants. So it's all okay. So, the message is let's treat this like the flu. Let's get this, like we've done with the flu for the last 30 years, and get back to normal.
That's a good way to end. Dr. Delgado, thank you so much for being back on.
Yes, and thank you again, Dan, for your leadership in all this.
I appreciate it.